The snow had buried the lodge poles. It rose higher than a man's shoulders, pressed against the bark walls like a silent enemy waiting for weakness. Smoke curled thinly from the center hole, but the fire beneath it was dying, shivering instead of burning, like it too had grown hungry. Tohan sat cross-legged by the stones, his face leathered by wind and age, his fingers outstretched toward heat that didn't reach him. His wife lay behind him, wrapped in every skin they owned. Their children slept in silence, not from peace, but from exhaustion. There was no food left to chew, not even bark. He had tried. 3 nights before, he had boiled snow with sinew and dried root. The snow hissed but refused to melt properly. The heat licked the pot but never truly burned. The sinew stayed stiff, the roots bitter. The water turned gray and sour. His wife forced it down. His daughter vomited it up. His son refused altogether. The fire had betrayed them. Tohan had lived through 10 winters, 2 of them brutal, 1 of them legendary. But this was something else. The snow didn't fall like it used to. It dropped with weight. It didn't whisper, it crushed. Game had vanished before the first frost. Even the birds were gone, as if the sky had forgotten them. The wind howled through the gap between the logs, and still he sat before the useless fire. That's when the memory came. Not like a thought, more like a flicker behind the eyes, a smell, a rhythm, a warmth that didn't belong to now. He was a boy again, watching through the smoke of a distant winter as his grandmother crouched low beside the earth. There had been no fire, just stones, round and black, arranged in a shallow pit. She had layered them with bark, meat, old corn. Then she had covered it all in snow and waited. No one believed her. But that night the food was soft, warm, alive with flavor, even when nothing else had been. Not everything that cooks must burn, she had whispered to him once. Some fire comes from within the stone. Tohan blinked. The lodge groaned in the cold. He reached toward the fire again, not to feed it, but to steal from it. He took 1 stone from the ring. It was barely warm. But it held something. Memory, maybe. He took 3 more. He placed them in the pit outside, buried beneath the snow, with the last bit of corn laid across bark. No one watched him, no one spoke. That night, he didn't eat. He didn't expect a miracle. But when he woke in the gray light of morning, something strange filled the air. It wasn't smoke. It wasn't hope. It was scent. Warm, real, impossible. And for the first time in many nights, his wife stirred not from cold, but from hunger. The smell was soft, barely there. But in a world swallowed by snow and silence, even a whisper of warmth carried like thunder. Tohan knelt over the pit he had made just before sunrise, hands brushing away the thin crust of fresh snow that had gathered in the night. The bark covering had browned slightly, darkened around the edges as if kissed by breath. He pressed a hand to it. Warm. Not hot, not steaming, but warm enough to stir memory from sleep. He peeled back the bark, careful and slow, revealing the small cobs of corn nestled atop the stones. The kernels had split open like they'd remembered how to grow. He picked one up. It didn't crack. It bent. He took a bite. Soft, sweet, cooked. Behind him his wife sat up. She hadn't spoken in 2 days, but now her voice came in a rasp. How? He looked over his shoulder. I didn't burn it, he said simply. I remembered. He told her, between bites, about his grandmother, how she had lived through the long hunger when he was small, how people had begged for salt, for deer, for warmth, and she had fed her family without flame. She would gather smooth stones from the river, round ones that rolled easily in her palm. She'd place them in the sun when it still held strength, or bury them near the fire coals just long enough to drink in heat. Then she'd layer them in pit stone, bark, food, more bark, then snow. He had thought it a game, something she did to keep children quiet. But now, as the warmth filled his belly and the frost in his bones began to ease, he knew it was a trick older than hunger. A trick born from watching how fire speaks and how stones remember. She said, "Heat doesn't need flame," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. It just needs patience and the right vessel. By midday, the snow outside the lodge had stopped. A pale light hung in the sky like a blind eye. He gathered more stones, ones with smooth bellies and dark skin, stones that had once belonged to rivers now frozen shut. He cleaned them with snow, then laid them near the heart of the fire, not in it, just near enough to feel, not to burn. His daughter watched him now. She didn't speak, but she followed his hands with wide, hollow eyes. He handed her a small stone. "Hold it," he said. "It needs you." She did. That evening he placed the new batch into the pit, layered them with the last of the dried squash, wrapped it in birch bark, and sealed it again with snow. The fire still flickered inside the lodge, but no one sat beside it. They sat near the pit instead. Waiting not for flame, but for the stone's remembering, they had almost burned it. The last of the corn, 5 ears, dried hard, as horn had been wrapped in birch and hung above the smoke hole, high where the heat could keep it from molding. It was meant for planting, not eating. A promise to spring, not a solution for winter. But no one spoke of spring anymore. The snow made such talk feel like lies. Tohan stared at the bundle as his wife slept, and the fire popped weakly behind him. He reached for it slowly, hand trembling not from hesitation, but hunger. He untied the cord and brought it down like it was something sacred, because it was. And because it wasn't just the corn that was running out. It was the time to do something before breath itself started disappearing from his family's bodies. He didn't grind it, didn't boil it, didn't burn it. He laid the ears gently on a broad piece of bark, alongside strips of sinew he'd soaked in snowmelt, and a few bark curls scraped from beneath the pine skins. All of it would go into the earth's mouth now, but not buried to vanish, buried to cook. Outside, he had already prepared the pit, a shallow bowl in the snow, stones at the bottom, still warm from the fire. Above that, the bark tray. He layered it carefully, corn, sinew, snow, another sheet of bark. Then he covered it with a thick mound of fresh powder. It hissed faintly when the snow touched the hidden heat, but it did not scream or smoke. He pressed his hands into the mound, sealing it. Then he sat in the stillness. This wasn't cooking. It was something quieter, slower, older. By midday, his daughter returned, with another stone, flat and dark, smooth as skin. She didn't speak, only handed it to him with both hands. He nodded, took it inside, and laid it near the fire's edge, turning it gently as his grandmother once had. "Let it listen," she used to say. "Let it feel warmth in silence." That evening the food was ready. Tohan uncovered the pit as the moon rose. The corn was soft now, the kernels golden and steaming faintly even in the freezing air. The sinew had loosened, chewy, but no longer leather. He carried it in slowly, one piece at a time, as if carrying medicine. They ate without words. His wife cried softly when she tasted the warmth. His son chewed in long, slow movements, like he didn't trust it to stay. His daughter curled up after 2 bites, not from weakness, but from the kind of fullness they hadn't felt in weeks. Tohan saved one ear, not to eat, to replant. He pressed it gently into a small pouch lined with bark and ash, tied it shut, and tucked it beneath the floor mat near the warmest part of the fire. Not everything should be burned. Some things should be remembered. The storm came back in the night, soft but relentless. It covered the pit again, smoothed the world into silence. But by then, the fire beneath the snow had already done its work. Tohan sat awake while his family slept, listening to the way snow whispered against the roof of the lodge. Not falling, pressing. The wind no longer screamed. It sighed, like something tired of warning. He added no more wood to the fire. There was almost none left. What little he had, he used to heat stones. His true fire now lived in them. The idea still felt like magic. The fire inside the lodge could not boil water anymore, but the stones remembered heat longer than flame could hold it. They held it patiently, then let it go in silence, slow as breath, deep as memory. It wasn't a method, it was a relationship. Tohan had begun to learn the rules. Rule 1. Not all stones work. He tested many. The ones that cracked or hissed too quickly he buried. The ones that darkened, held warmth, and cooled without complaint he named. Sleep eater, long heat, gray belly. Naming wasn't superstition, it was gratitude. Rule 2. The bark matters, too thin and the food burns. Too thick and it smothers. Birch worked best. Pine made everything bitter. He remembered his grandmother spitting once and saying, "Even trees can be jealous." Rule 3. Snow isn't the enemy, it's the lid. Without snow, the heat escapes. With snow, it traps the warmth, wraps it around the food like a bear skin. The fire outside burns fast. The fire beneath the snow lasts. That morning Tohan taught his daughter how to heat the stones just enough near the fire, not in it. She sat cross-legged beside him, watching as he rotated them with a stick. He handed her one. It was warm, not hot, and she smiled as if she'd been given fire itself. Together they placed it in the next pit, layered with bark and a small handful of dried mushrooms they'd found beneath a drift days before. She sealed it with snow herself, pressing it gently like smoothing a baby's blanket. Later that day, a neighbor wandered over the first visitor in weeks. His cheeks were sunken, his breath ragged. "I thought I saw smoke yesterday," he said. Tohan nodded. There was no smoke. The man frowned. "I smelled food." "There was food," Tohan said, "but the fire was sleeping." The neighbor crouched beside the pit, confused. "You didn't cook it?" "I did," Tohan said, "but not the way you think." The man shook his head, muttered something about foolishness, and left. But 2 hours later, he returned with a small bundle of roots and a look of shame. "Can your stones share with mine?" he asked. Tohan said nothing. He simply handed the man a flat black stone warmed by firelight and showed him where to dig. The winter was far from over, but the fire was spreading. It wasn't the heat that made them believe, it was the taste. By the 7th night of the long freeze, 4 more families had come quietly, without pride. Each carried some small thing: roots dug from frozen beds, frozen squirrel meat scraped thin with dull blades, even strips of softened hide once meant for shoes. Tohan asked for nothing in return. Only that they listen, only that they learn. He showed them the rhythm, how to warm the stones without breaking them, how to stack them so they didn't smother each other, how to layer food between bark and snow. Some laughed, even as their stomachs growled. But they followed his hands. Hunger teaches faster than any elder. That night, they gathered around the first shared pit, wide enough for 4 meals, packed tight with soaked roots and meat shavings. Tohan arranged it with the reverence of ceremony, and when he sealed the mound with snow, the children bowed without being told. No one spoke as the hours passed. Snow drifted down like silence itself. The wind curled around them, testing their resolve. The fire inside the lodge was long dead useless now. All light came from the moon, and all warmth came from the earth below. Then came the smell, not smoke, something gentler, rich, sweet, old, like a memory breathing out through the snow. One of the elders, hard-eyed and long silent, leaned down close and whispered, "That's what my mother's lodge used to smell like." Tohan didn't smile. He only began to dig. When they peeled back the bark and lifted the steaming roots into their bowls, no one moved. Even in the deepest hunger, even in the oldest pain, there was a moment when the body forgets urgency just long enough to be grateful. The first bite made the children close their eyes. It wasn't just warm, it was flavored. The roots had softened into something nourishing. The meat had absorbed the bark's smoke kiss. The snow had melted into a broth that clung to the tongue like fat. Someone wept. No one asked questions after that. They only asked for stones. Tohan began marking each family's stones with small cut circles for heat holders, slashes for long heaters, dots for quiet rocks. The children memorized them like names of stars. One girl carved a face into hers and called it Little Belly. The lodge circle shifted, not because they had food, but because they had method. The difference was sacred, and still some mocked. "You hide your fire underground like a mole," one hunter sneered. "We used to roast meat with flame." Tohan looked at him calmly and said, "Your flame eats more than it feeds." "My fire remembers." That night the hunter came back carrying nothing but a frozen rabbit and his shame. He sat in silence as Tohan placed a stone in his hand. The fire beneath the snow said nothing. But the taste it gave answered everything. The best stones lived under moving water. That's what his grandmother had said, her voice raspy, whispering through tobacco smoke as she taught him to feel with his hands, not just his eyes. Stones from still ponds were lazy. Stones from cliffs were proud. But stones from rivers knew motion, pressure, time. They carried the memory of flow. So, when the food began to run short again because now more mouths were gathering around the pit each night, Tohan knew where he had to go. He left before sunrise, his daughter beside him. She carried a basket woven with spruce root and sealed with tree pitch. The river was nearly frozen, but he knew its mouth still breathed. It always did. Water doesn't forget the way home. They reached the stream by midday, breath steaming, limbs stiff. The surface shimmered with a thin sheet of ice, but beneath it the current still whispered. Tohan broke through gently with a staff, then reached in barehanded. The cold bit into his bones like truth. But he didn't pull back. Instead, he felt. For shape, for silence, for history. Some stones slipped from his grip immediately, too smooth, too slick. Others bit his fingers jagged, impatient, but a few sank into his palm like a heartbeat, heavy but balanced. Round but not perfect, warm even in the ice. He held one to his ear. Nothing. Then he held it to his chest. Stillness, deep stillness. He nodded. "You remember," he whispered. By sundown the basket was full. Back at the lodge, he laid them all out in a ring and lit the fire, not to warm the room, but to warm the stones. His daughter helped, placing each one near the coals, turning them gently, speaking soft words she made up as she went. "Sleep now, belly holder. Wake slow, fire breath. Don't forget us, little red." Tohan didn't correct her. Words held weight, even if they were new. By the third night, the new stones were ready, and it showed. The heat they gave was deeper, less harsh, more patient. The food cooked more evenly. The scent reached farther. Elders began to speak, again around the pit, telling stories they hadn't told in years. One man sang. Tohan gave each family one stone of their own, now not just to use, but to keep, to heat, to name. Children began competing to find the best ones, bringing pebbles, testing them near the coals, arguing over which ones listened best. Some were too eager, some shattered in heat, but every failure taught them more. The lodge became a classroom, the pit became the drum, and the stones became kin. By now, the fire inside the lodge was rarely lit. Not because they didn't need it, but because they had found something better. They had found fire that didn't burn, fire that remembered, fire that fed. The knock was soft, a hand on the hide flap. Then a voice raspy, cautious. "Tohan?" He opened the flap to a wall of wind. Snow swirled like ash. And in the storm stood a figure wrapped in torn elk hide, half covered in frost. Behind him, two others. A woman hunched over, cradling a bundle. A boy with eyes too wide for his face. They said nothing at first. They didn't have to. Tohan stepped aside. Inside, the warmth wasn't from fire, it was from stone. Heated rocks glowed faintly from their bed near the wall, nestled like sleeping coals. The smell of slow-cooked bark broth hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The woman inhaled sharply, like she couldn't believe it was real. "They said you had no flame," the man murmured. "I don't," Tohan said. "Not the kind that dances." They sat. The child said nothing, but stared at the stones like they were alive. The woman unwrapped the bundle, brittle cattail root, a frozen strip of dried fish, a handful of cracked corn, all she had. "Will it work?" she asked. Tohan didn't answer with words. He simply took the offering and began preparing the pit. The boy followed every movement, how Tohan laid the bark, how he nestled the warm stones beneath, how he added a bit of snow to hold in moisture, how he sealed the mound like tucking in a child for sleep. The boy didn't blink. As they waited, the others began arriving. A cousin from the southern ridge, a family that had once mocked him. A widower with nothing but an old deer bone filled with frozen marrow, all of them worn thin, all of them holding something they hoped was enough to trade. Tohan gave each a place by the circle. There were no lectures, no speeches, just food, slowly cooked, patiently offered. When the first meal was ready, he opened the snow lid like a gift. The broth steamed, the roots had softened. The fish had bloomed open into something close to meat. A spoon was passed, then another, then hands. No one spoke for many breaths. Then the boy, eyes wide, whispered, "It tastes like it dreamed first." Tohan smiled. That night, no one left. They slept crowded in the lodge, side by side. The air was warm not because of the fire, but because of the bodies, the breath, the shared silence. A stone rested beside each. Sleeper, still warm, wrapped in bark, or cradled like a child. Before sleep took him, Tohan whispered the old truth aloud to the gathered dark. When fire is buried with care, it doesn't go out. It becomes a memory that feeds you. The wind howled outside, but the pit glowed. And no one went hungry. They came at dawn, blanketed in furs, their faces hard with pride and frost. 3 elders, 2 scouts, and the head councilman who once told Tohan his stone-cooking foolishness would lead the tribe into ruin. Now they stood at the edge of his lodge, squinting into the cold, while the scent of warm food curled from the snow pit like a promise. Tohan met them outside. "You called for us?" the councilman asked. Tohan shook his head. "I didn't." A long pause. "Then why are we here?" "Because you're hungry," he said, calmly. The younger scout looked away, embarrassed. The councilman's jaw clenched. But the elder woman among them stepped forward and knelt beside the snow lid of the pit. "May I see?" she asked. Tohan nodded. Together they opened it slowly, like unveiling an altar. Inside, tender slices of wild yam shimmered with heat, resting atop bark soaked through with rich broth. Bits of squirrel meat flaked apart in silence. The scent was strong now, deep and earthy, touched with sweetness from crushed birch buds laid over the top. The elder woman breathed in, then wept. "My mother made this. Not like this, but like this," she whispered. "We used to eat this when the rivers froze and even the dogs were quiet." The councilman frowned. "Why didn't you share this method sooner?" Tohan didn't answer immediately. He lifted a warm stone from the edge of the pit and handed it to the youngest scout. "Tell me," he said, "does this burn?" The boy shook his head. "Does it feed?" A nod. "Did it ask you for anything?" "No." Tohan turned back to the councilman. "I didn't share it because you already knew better. You had fire, you had pride, you had plans. I had stones and memory, so I listened to them instead." The wind paused for a moment, long enough for no one to speak. Then the elder woman stood and placed a hand on Tohan's shoulder. "Teach them anyway," she said, "even if they didn't listen before." Tohan agreed, but with a rule. "I will show anyone who asks. But I will not cook for them. They must gather their own stones, heat them with their own breath, prepare the pit with their own hands. The fire will not remember them unless they speak to it first." The councilman said nothing, but he took a small stone from beside the pit and held it for a long while. That night, Tohan taught 17 people how to build the pit, how to listen to the stones, how to bury the flame, not kill it. No torches lit the snow, no drums were struck, just quiet hands moving through winter, warmed by earth and humility. It melted like a secret. Not all at once, not with thunder or roaring winds, just a quiet shift in the air, like the land exhaling, a drip from the lodge roof, a dark streak across the packed white path, the sound of snow releasing its grip from the branches above. That morning, Tohan stepped outside and felt something strange on his cheeks. Warmth, real warmth. Not the heat of fire, not the memory of breath, but the sun thin and gold, breaking through a sky that no longer pressed down like a lid. The first bird call came at midday. Just one, cautious and high. It startled a boy who'd never heard birds in winter. The elders said nothing, but their eyes softened. Later, children kicked at the slush and laughed. It was wild and awkward, that sound like legs remembering how to run. But it filled the spaces between lodges where silence used to sleep. The pit was still cooking. Even as the world thawed, people still gathered around it. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Food now came from traps again, a few early. Roots had been pulled from the wet ground. But still they brought what they had to the circle sinew, root, bone, bark, and asked to cook it in the old way. Tohan let them, but he never stopped reminding them, the stones don't work because they're hot, they work because you listen. One boy brought a broken river rock and asked if it could still remember heat. Tohan touched the crack with 2 fingers, then handed it back. Not this time, he said gently. But it remembers trying. At the council lodge they carved a new symbol into the central post, a ring of stones beneath a curve of bark, no flame, no smoke, just the outline of what had saved them. They called it the fire that slept. On the final night of the deep winter, before the great melt turned the ground to mud, Tohan sat alone in the pit circle. His daughter brought him the last of the cooked yams and rested her head on his shoulder. "Will we still need the stones next winter?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "The winter might not need them, but we still do." He pointed to the little one sleeping beside his wife, born during the storm, named in secret, wrapped in fur, and fed her first meal from the warmth of a stone pit. "She'll never remember this winter," he said, "but she'll eat from stones the rest of her life, and that will be enough." They sat in silence, watching the snow drip from the trees. A dog barked. Someone sang a few notes of a planting song. Spring was near, but the fire beneath the snow would never leave them. He was old when they came asking. Not the council, not the hunters, children, grandchildren, ones born after the great snow, who had never felt their belly twist from hunger, who had never tasted cold so deep it rattled inside the bones. They gathered around him by the pit, though the pit was no longer needed. Fires burned bright now. Game was plenty. Roots came easy. But still, they asked him to show them the way of the stone. "Why?" he asked gently, though he already knew. A girl no older than 8 summers held out a polished black rock, round as an egg. "Because my mother said this saved her voice." Tohan smiled. So he taught again. He showed them how to pick the right stone, not for size, but for memory. How to warm it just enough. How to know if it would crack or carry. He taught them the layering of bark, the placement of food, the sealing with snow or wet moss. He taught them to wait. That was always the hardest part. "Fire is impatient," he told them, "but stone is a teacher." The children cooked roots, sweet berries, even strips of dried fish. Their parents watched from the shadows, half laughing, half remembering. Some wept and didn't know why. And when the food came out soft and hot and glowing with scent, the children gasped as if they had summoned the sun itself. They didn't call it cooking, they called it stone warming. It became a rite. A tradition, not out of need but out of gratitude. Each child, when they reached their 7th winter, would gather their own stone. They would heat it, feed it, speak to it, and they would share its warmth. Tohan watched them for many years. His hands grew slower, his voice quieter. But every time the snow came down, someone would visit him carrying a basket of stones and asking for stories. He never refused. When he died, they didn't bury him in flame. They wrapped him in birch and laid him on a bed of river stones, warmed one last time by the breath of children. Over him, they built a final snow lid, not to trap him but to seal in his warmth. He was not set to ash. He was cooked into the land he fed. In spring, the pit where he lay gave rise to wild mint, thick and fragrant. His grandson carved a circle of stones around it and whispered, "He didn't feed us with fire. He fed us with memory." And so, long after the great hunger passed, when snow falls too thick, when wood is too wet, to burn, when silence wraps the lodges again, the people still gather around the pit. They press their hands to warm stones. They wait, and they remember the fire that didn't burn.